So, after the Constitution was written in 1787, this new rule book for the United States of America, it was sent out to the states for ratification. And slowly, the states, over a 10-month period, began to accept the new rule book. This new Constitution gave us a Congress, a president, a Supreme Court. So it set up our government. And when 9 of the 13 states agreed to the Constitution, it became the law of the land. So elections were held for the first Congress of the United States. This first Congress met in New York City in 1789. Remember, a Congress is a 2-year meeting, but the very first Congress met in 1789 in New York City, which was the nation's first capital. So not only do we have Congress showing up that begins to pass the laws, but we also have an election for president. And as you can tell from this chart, most of the states had accepted the Constitution and were able to run elections, and George Washington was elected president by the electors in the Electoral College of that state. A few states had not accepted the Constitution yet by the time we were voting for George Washington in late 1788, December of 1788, and January of 1789. This was a weird election, a special one. There's never been one like it, but we had to get a president, so we started electing George Washington at the end of 1788 in December and also in January of 1789. North Carolina and Rhode Island had not accepted the Constitution yet, so they missed out on this opportunity to vote for George Washington, and New York had missed the deadline. But it didn't matter, really, because George Washington had got enough of the states to vote for him. He was unanimously elected as president, and John Adams would become vice president. So George Washington's first term, from 1789 to 1793, he takes over and gets America up and going. It's going to take a lot of energy. You've studied inertia before, so you know that it takes a lot of energy to get something like the United States government up and going, and George Washington was the perfect person to do it. And he is a president that will be setting precedents. Remember, a precedent is a tradition. So George Washington will say, "So help me God," when he's sworn in, when he takes the oath, and so every other president has said, "So help me God." George Washington just wanted to be called Mr. President. So everyone else who's become president has just gone by Mr. President. No fancy title, no Your Excellency or anything like that, just Mr. President. George Washington would create a cabinet. George Washington would stop after 2 terms. These are precedents that presidents will follow in the future. He knew that he was setting the tone for other presidents who came after him. And it's going to take George Washington's personality, his character, his skill, his experience to get America up and going. He is really, truly one of the greatest Americans. He's not perfect, of course, but he is what the country needed. John Adams was the first vice president. John Adams is generally considered a Federalist, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But it wasn't like George Washington and John Adams were close friends. In fact, John Adams, as vice president, was kind of left out on many of the decisions and cabinet meetings because no one was quite sure really what to do with the vice president in the early days. Over time, the vice president has become more involved in the running of the country, and today the president and the vice president usually like each other, and they're usually next to each other when decisions are made. One of the first things that happens when the new Congress gets together in New York City is they pass the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789. The Constitution says we will have a Supreme Court and lower federal courts, but it leaves it up to Congress to determine the exact makeup and the numbers of the court system. So the Congress passes the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789, and George Washington, as the first president, has to appoint all of those judges. And he also appoints John Jay as the first Chief Justice of the United States. So now we've got the federal courts and the Supreme Court up and running. We've got Congress, we've got a president, we've got a vice president. George Washington also asked for a cabinet. These are his helpers, these people who run big chunks of the government. The original cabinet under George Washington were only 4 positions. Secretary of State, War, Treasury, and the Attorney General. And of those four, really two really dominate. It's not that Henry Knox isn't important. Maybe you've heard of Knoxville or Fort Knox. And Edmund Randolph was our first Attorney General. Important, but I would not put them on the same level as Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. These founding fathers really helped shape the country early on in the Washington cabinet. Again, they do not really see eye to eye. These power players, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, a Southern farmer, slave owner, a Democratic Republican, and the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, kind of a banker from New York, a Federalist, they don't really see eye to eye. They have different views and visions of what America will be like. I think it's fair to say that both of them loved America and wanted to see it succeed. It's just their vision for what America would be was quite different. And the two first political parties will start to develop around these two men and their personalities and their views. The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton, was a party that loved England and banking and factories. They thought America would be a country of industry. Mostly, if you're a Federalist, you would be from the North. Federalists back in the day wanted tariffs as a way to bring in money to the American Treasury. So, for example, if the French wanted to sell their wine in the United States, they might have to give $1 per bottle. And of course, that $1 per bottle would go as a tariff into our bank account, the Treasury of the United States, and then the U.S. government would use that money from the tariff. So that was something that the Federalists believed in, tariffs. It's still around today. Presidents today did not invent tariffs. They've been around since George Washington. If you're a Federalist, you wanted a strong national government. And you wanted a national bank. You thought we needed a big boss bank that would tell the smaller banks what to do and regulate the money policy of the country. So the Federalists were a party that really revolved around these main points, and with Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, at the center of it. Now, it may seem weird to think that here we are just a few years after the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton, who fought in the Revolutionary War against the British, really wanted to be buddies with the British. Well, it was all about money. He saw that America would grow and prosper if we traded with the British. So the opposite of all of these things would be the other party, the Democratic Republican Party. Thomas Jefferson was the leader, and Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans believed in a small national government with states in charge. They saw the states as having the real power, not the U.S. government. Mostly, the Democratic Republicans were made up of Southerners. Most were farmers. So Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans saw America as a nation of farms and small towns. Jefferson, as Secretary of State, did not want tariffs. He thought tariffs would hurt America. And of course, Jefferson would look at the U.S. Constitution and saw that nowhere in the Constitution is it mentioned that the government can create a big bank. So he was against it. And these Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, would love France. Remember, France had helped us win the Revolution. Jefferson had spent a lot of time in France, and they looked to France as an example of liberty and freedom. So they wanted America's best buddy to be France. So these two parties are going to battle it out. One of the big battles will revolve around Hamilton's view of what the Treasury should do dealing with our money. The money of the United States was a major issue. It still is. I mean, think about how much money is being spent and circulated at this very moment in the United States. George Washington knew we had to get our money system up and running and under control. And he put brilliant Alexander Hamilton in charge of it. So when I think about the Treasury today, I think of Hamilton. When you see a $10 banknote with Hamilton's picture on one side, you should know that the Treasury building is on the back, because Hamilton was critical in getting the Treasury up and running so that America would have money to do things, pay our bills, pay our soldiers, pay the members of Congress. Money is critical. So Hamilton's plan that he comes up with revolves around three things. One, tariffs. Two, create a big boss bank, a national bank of the United States. Now, there were small banks in all the states, but Hamilton thought we needed a large national bank that would regulate the money and the economy of the United States. He also believed that we would need basically a national credit card or a national debt, that the federal government should assume all of the state debts, take on all of the debts that the states have into one big credit card, and the entire country should pay on that. This would establish credit and give America kind of financial standing in the world if we showed that we can pay our bills. So we assume all the state debts, put it on one credit card bill, and have America pay that bill. That would make America seem like we know what we're doing with our money and our finances. So here is an example of what Hamilton would say. He would look at New York's credit card debt. Let's just say it was $13 million. America will pay that. But South Carolina didn't know anything. But we'll move on to Massachusetts. Massachusetts owed $7 million, so put that on the credit card of the United States. Pennsylvania owed $9 million. But the southern states, as you can see, according to this example, these are just made-up numbers to prove the point. The southern states really didn't owe a lot of money, mostly because they didn't have to pay their workers because of slavery. So they could use the money that they would normally pay workers to pay off debt and so on. So in this example, you can see that the total debt is $33 million. And now Hamilton will ask all of the states to help pay for this $33 million. And of course, if you're a southern state, you're like, well, wait, this is not fair. We had zero debt, and now you're asking us as a state to help pay for the American credit card, which we owed nothing on. You're asking us to pay New York and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Rhode Island's debt. So men like Thomas Jefferson, the Southern Democratic Republicans, said they would never vote for Hamilton's plan about tariffs and the national bank and the national credit card and one national debt, unless maybe. So Jefferson pushed for putting the capital of the country in the South. Because remember, the money situation, the money center was in New York City. That's where Wall Street and the stock market was. But it also was the political center of the country at the time. It was where the capital was. So these Southerners, like Jefferson, wanted the capital, the political capital, moved south. You can keep the money in Wall Street in New York City, but move the political capital to the south. And that's what they did. As part of a deal to accept Hamilton's plan, they moved the capital from the north, slowly making its way to the south. Of course, Washington, D.C. did not exist then. States of Virginia and Maryland gave up land, swampy land that wasn't really that good for much. And over a 10-year period, slaves would turn the land given by Maryland and Virginia into a new federal city, meaning it's not part of any state. But that federal city, named after George Washington, is located in the South. So the money and the money power is still in New York City, but the political power, the power of government, is moved to the South. And that makes Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans happy. So here's the story of how our capital works. New York City from 1789 to 1790. 10 years, the capital will move to Philadelphia while they're working on this new federal city. People in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia, they thought there's no way they're going to finish the city. So they agreed to be a temporary capital, hoping and thinking that D.C. would never get finished. But it does get finished in the year 1800, and that's when it becomes the nation's capital. So the point is, Hamilton got what he wanted: a national bank, the national debt, tariffs. The Southern Democrat or Republicans, like Jefferson, gets the capital. So Treasury is a major part of George Washington's first term. Treasury gets up and running. Hamilton's plan gets enacted. And it does really bind the country together. Now, of course, today, We still have a national bank, but it kind of has a different feel and a different vibe than it did way back in the early days of the United States. Today, our national bank is actually called the Federal Reserve System, which is, there's several of these buildings across the country made up of people who've been appointed by the president who kind of, once they're there, they start kind of overseeing the money and the economy and the banking industry of the United States. So when you look at some of your banknotes today, it's important to remember that on them are two reminders of kind of the old days and modern times. One, if you see on the right here, you can see the yellow arrow pointing to the Treasury seal. This reminds us that the Treasury Department physically creates the money, like they literally print the money and stamp the coins, and the Treasury says it's worth something, right? This is just a rectangle until the Treasury of the United States government says it's worth something. And since America is a strong, powerful country with a great economy, this rectangle can be used to get things. Whether it's a burrito or a whole bunch of these, you can get a car. It means it's worth something. But it also reminds, when I look at this banknote, I see the Federal Reserve stamp. Reminds me that the national bank of today, the Federal Reserve, regulates and circulates this banknote. The Federal Reserve decides how much money we need to have in circulation. Maybe certain regions of the country need more or need less, so they allow more money to be, or ask for more money to be printed or coined and then shipped to that region. But when I see this banknote that has Hamilton on it, or any banknote for that matter, whether it's a $1, $5, $10, $20, $50, $100, it has both of these, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. So Hamilton gets us up and going, and just as something to think about, one of the big parts of Treasury is the U.S. Mint. The Mint makes the coins. The Bureau of Engraving and Printing, that produces the banknotes, like the $1 bill, the $5 bill, the $10 bill, the $20, the $50, the $2 bill. But the Mint makes the coins. Coins are still important. When you look at a coin today made by the U.S. Treasury, Mint, United States Mint of the U.S. Treasury, most of the coins you will see will come from one of these three mints: Philadelphia, San Francisco, and Denver. And of course, you can tell what mint made it by the little mark that's on it. If you see the P, that tells you that it was made in Philadelphia. The S, San Francisco, and a D tells me that it was coined and stamped in Denver. If I look at the nickel, also made by the U.S. Mint, which is part of the U.S. Treasury, it'll also tell you. Any coin will tell you where it was made. I chose the nickel because it would be interesting to think what Hamilton would think about when he thinks of our money with his political adversary on some of that money. Thomas Jefferson on the nickel and on the $2 bill. But again, Hamilton and Jefferson, they may not have seen eye to eye. They didn't really like each other, but they did respect each other, and they worked together with George Washington to get America up and going under George Washington's first term, his first 4 years in office.